Been a quiet week in Lake Wobegon, right? Now, most of you live in Davidson County. A few of you come from outside of Davidson County, but I feel like I've been kind of preaching this, but nobody's been listening to me. Out there in the real world of Volunteer State, there was very, very much celebration among the students yesterday. And overwhelmingly, they feel that every one of their great desires is about to be met because of the outcome of the election. So, and you know, on the other side of the fence, my own children were calling, you know, kind of alternately. One was just expressing surprise, I suppose, more than anything else. But, and so in the, I guess, 36 hours since the poll closed, everybody's kind of saying, well, why did all the prognosticators make so many mistakes? And I think that a few of you back in the spring in February saw this article in the New York Times, which I thought today might be a good time to remind you of. If the clicker will work here, I guess I can use the arrow. That Steve Inskeep, who works for National Public Radio, back in February, when the Republican Party was saying, well, he's not going to win the primary, he is just a kind of a one-shot thing, this will not last very long, but the Republican Party was saying, this man doesn't have political potential. And so Steve Inskeep, who some of you might have heard him, he came here to the public library a couple of years ago. He has a book called Jackson Land, which is really quite an interesting book about Indian removal, among other things. But Steve Inskeep wrote this great article in the New York Times in February about how Trump was the personification of Jackson. And the more I have thought about this, and I went back and reread this article yesterday, the more I thought about this, the more I think Steve Inskeep was right on target. Because let me tell you, when John Quincy Adams lost in 1828 to Jackson, there were many naysayers who thought the world was coming to an end when Jackson was going to become president. What would this man do? Both of them had, in many ways, the same silence, I suppose, on the major issues. You didn't know where Jackson stood. He was just appropriately vague on most things he talked about, and Trump was too. But you know, Jackson didn't give a clear indication of his policy positions, whereas to contrast Jackson with John Quincy Adams, John Quincy Adams had this agenda. He had been Secretary of State. He knew how government worked from the inside as well as the out. And Jackson, you know, he had had a successful career as a general, and he wasn't too worried about the workings of Washington. And let me tell you, when Jackson was sworn in, I don't know what's going to happen on January 20th, but I can guarantee it will not be the wild party that was thrown by some of your ancestors in 1829 when Jackson was sworn in on March the 4th. So I want for you to just keep thinking about this, and if you go onto your computer and just Google Donald Trump, Andrew Jackson, you'll get the article. Yes, sir?
I read an article, kind of extensive article in Atlantic Monthly, and they said that Trump's personality was most nearest to Jackson and Nixon.
Yeah.
His personality, his kind of personality.
That's right. And so, except that I think Trump was always much more personable and much more comfortable with people than Richard Nixon was. I think Jackson was very comfortable with people, and he was kind of a no nonsense, I know what to do, leave me alone, let me do this. Nixon, I think, had some insecurities there. Yes?
We could ban this around all day, but I've heard him compare Trump compared to LBJ.
I think there is some things to compare there. I think there definitely are some comparisons to be made there too. So people are going to be scratching their heads about this for a long time. But again, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I stand every day of the week in Gallatin in various history classes before angry people. They feel that the economy has treated them badly, and they don't like it. And so Trump especially spoke to this group of rural folks who feel that they've been left behind, and they blame it on whatever they can find to blame it on, but mostly the federal government. In U.S. History 1, the first half of the American History Survey, I start out and kind of go through this week after week of the big questions in American history are, what do we want our government to do? What should the role of the federal government be? What does it mean to be an American? And what should our relationship as the United States be with the rest of the world? 3 questions. So yesterday when I walked into class, the students were really quite excited. And so I said, now let's put this in the context of this course. So what do you think the election said? What did the voters of this country say when they elected Donald Trump as the president-elect, the future president here? How would they be answering this question? What do we want our government to do? Now, first answer out of the box. We want more health care. He's going to give us more health care. And I said to this student, I said, what are you talking about? And she said, oh, he's going to get rid of Obamacare. Now, okay, I did understand that. But somehow, in a certain group of rural people's mind, which appear to be a lot of them out there, in a certain group of rural people, they believe that Obamacare is less health care than more health care. It's not these arguments about picking your doctor and managed care at all. They think that getting rid of the plan, the exchange, is going to somehow give them more Medicaid and Medicare benefits. Now, an interesting thing happened. I learned something interesting about the Tennessee Exchange yesterday, because we have a temporary history professor who is teaching because somebody's on maternity leave, and she has a full-time salary, but she doesn't get any benefits, which means health insurance. So Katie has insurance through the exchange because she's been adjuncting at a whole bunch of different colleges. And so this is what she said yesterday. She said, a month ago, I got a letter saying that Blue Cross was pulling out of the exchange and that I was going to need to pick another company. And she said she really thought that because so many of our students got this same letter, that they said, oh no, we're losing our insurance. And so they have translated that to a President Trump will give them what they think they're going to have, which is totally full coverage. And those days are kind of over. Anyway, it's interesting. So next person. He's going to keep us safe. And, I'm looking at a classroom where I consider that any day at least 2 people have a handgun in their backpack. I mean, this is a common thing. and I'm already not really feeling very safe. And so my students, but they really feel that we are, as a country, unsafe. And I can't quite get my hands around that. But mostly they feel the economy has left them behind. And the other thing about this is, I've been aware of this on one level, but I haven't really exactly said, oh my gosh, until yesterday. Overwhelmingly, my community college students despise, absolutely hate Hillary Clinton. And I cannot put my finger on it. It's like they like Bill Clinton more than Hillary Clinton. They like Barack Obama more than Hillary Clinton, but they see her as the devil incarnate. There is something about her persona that a lot of rural Americans absolutely despise and are scared of. Yes?
I read this morning before I came that the Russian foreign minister came out and said that there had been contacts between the Russian government and the Trump campaign during the election. So the scandals are already starting to bubble up.
Well, I mean, I think it's going to be interesting to see. What happens. And, I mean, Trump has his hands full with Congress, because even though we've got a unified party, the same party controlling both houses of Congress and the White House, that does not mean these people are in agreement about policy. And, I frankly do not think a President Trump is going to abolish Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I think that he won't abolish the Affordable Health Care Act. I think it will be tweaked, but the name of Obamacare will be erased, which will make it more palatable to students and other folks. But I don't think he's going to get rid of that. But you know, as well as I do, there are people in Congress who want to get rid of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So he's going to have his hands full, as Hillary Clinton would have had her hands full, because the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren side of the equation really was going to hold her feet to the fire of, you're going to have to do something about banking. So I think either candidate was going to have trouble, whichever direction they ended up going. But I think that time will tell what's going to happen to Trump. And guess what now? My computer has decided it's going to freeze up here. I have no mouse when I've got some really interesting... You see the mouse? Oh. Well, this is going to be an interesting procedure. See, it won't... Okay, all right. So this is what the New York Times... Let's see if this will let me click on my link. Will it? No. It won't. That's what the New York Times said yesterday. Trump rides rave of fury that may damage the global economy. And, the surprising thing is to look at that map and look at where the state's electoral votes went for Donald Trump. And the parts of Tennessee that went for Donald Trump, which is practically the whole state, but they are places where manufacturing jobs are no longer there. Sunday night, I chanced upon a story on one of the local news channels, some of you undoubtedly saw it, about a man in Jackson. They were at the TV reporter was at the Jackson bus station. And at the Jackson bus station, this man was saying goodbye to his wife and children and getting on the bus to ride to somewhere in the Midwest, either Kansas or Nebraska, where he had a job as a truck driver. And, he is a very strong Trump supporter. And the point was that I'm having to ride the bus and be away from my family in order to be employed to support my family. And so, of course, again, that is because of all of the manufacturing jobs that were once very prosperous in rural and middle-sized towns that are now pretty well gone. And honestly, I don't think Donald Trump is going to be able to create factories or reopen factories that are closed. Now, where are you, Tommy? I've seen you somewhere. Right here. Tommy Tompkins lives in Gallatin. His father started, and Tommy owned still, and Tommy ran Crescent Furniture in Gallatin, a very good business. His dad was a wonderful businessman. Tommy was a wonderful businessman and kept this thing going. And it is still going, and it is still selling Crescent Furniture. However, the management is Tommy's son and nephew, right? And they run the business, and so consequently, Tommy takes history classes. That's far less headaches taking a history class. But, Tommy, as a businessman, he prided himself on the jobs in Gallatin, the craftsmen in Gallatin that he employed. So, Tommy, say a few words about small town manufacturing.
She hit me before I walked in. I am not prepared, but this being a family-owned business and third generation running it now. But for 60 years we manufactured in Gallatin, and we made solid cherry, solid mahogany, solid maple in a medium price range. Some of you may have even bought it over here. And a pretty good value. It was actually, we were always known to be the best value in the medium price range. And so, so we have this heritage of doing this. Well, about 16 years ago, life changed. Was that Asia came into the picture. And when I'm saying Asia, there's one great big country that headed it up. But it was not only China, it was other countries too. So we decided that, and it was tremendously hard, because we had 225 crazy employees. And but the decision was made that Crescent's either going to be a dinosaur, and it's gone, or we're going to go to Asia. And reluctantly moved all our production to Vietnam. And we are competitive today. We're still making solid cherry, solid maple, plus a lot of other woods that we get. And it's being shipped to stores all over the United States, including V.F. Myers in Nashville. So, but it's just a different world. And for anybody to say, okay, Trump's in, Crescent's going to start manufacturing in Gallatin, with all of the restrictions and with all the competitiveness that's out there, I can't answer any other, but I don't see my company.
Hank?
Let me meet you. My dad was Davidson.
This is Davis Furniture, Crescent Furniture.
Could never have been in business. Marilyn's helping me write a little story, and if it wasn't for the Davis people,
They were friends. Everybody
yes,
worked
but
together.
they wouldn't sell us the product, so my dad had to go manufacture it somewhere else.
Well, my dad had a plant near the Titan Stadium and one in Portland, which wasn't too far away. And we shut it down a while back, and we weren't smart enough to go to Vietnam. But some of the finest furniture in the world is being made in Vietnam. And so don't be too scared of it. It's not as good as what Crescent and Davis were, but
No, and it's not American jobs. That's, I think, the thing. And so, I guess my kind of thought about the man at the bus station in Jackson is very much what I see my students doing. They want to stay where they are. And there are very few of you who were born and have lived your whole life in Nashville, Tennessee. But there are a lot of folks out there who have lived their whole life in several generations back in Trousdale County, Macon County, Grundy County, all of these rural places. And they don't want to leave even if the job is better and even if they have to ride the bus to the Alaska border. They do not want to leave Lafayette, Salina, Byrdstown. And if you really want a view of real America, I will drive you up through those counties along the Kentucky border. Byrdstown, Tennessee is one of the poorest places I have ever been. Try Wartburg in Morgan County. It's another one, very poor place. And yet these people are eking out the barest minimum. I mean, you know, there are churches whose congregations are going to some of these places in our state and putting in water systems because some of these people in Tennessee don't even have pure water to drink. And they are angry for a lot of different reasons, and the vote was a vote to me of desperation. So I want to show you, and now I'm going to, I guess I'm going to have to use the mouse. I want to show you these numbers because I think these numbers also say a lot about the election. I interpret it not as racial at all, but as rural, the pattern where the Trump support was the greatest. I see it as rural versus urban. However, you cannot deny the decline in people who voted, mainly because they didn't like the candidates. I think in many instances because the media kept saying she's ahead, she's ahead, she's ahead. There were some, particularly African Americans in cities, who said, well, it doesn't really matter. I don't need to vote because she's going to win. So I think there were fewer African Americans voting than had voted in 2012. But it wasn't just Hillary Clinton who got less votes than Barack Obama. Donald Trump got less votes than Mitt Romney. Now, the difference here, if you notice, and I got these numbers off of the New York Times website late last night. The Wall Street Journal website had tiny little differences in the numbers, but so you're going to see these numbers wiggling. But whatever the numbers were in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, Clinton got the most popular votes, and this is why we're not going to see the Electoral College abolished anytime soon, because states feel that the Electoral College gives them a louder voice than a popular vote would be. So look at these numbers. I think people will be analyzing this, and I've said for years, nothing is history for at least 25 years. So we're talking about current events. But I think that I have the message to both sides is it probably isn't the end of the world. That's what people thought in 1828. He's going to have to make some compromises on what he said. We'll see what comes out. I mean, I think there's some things that may be revealed, just like you were talking about, between now and January 20th. And the other side is we're just going to have to watch this and see. I don't think it's going to be the end of the world, but neither do I think these people who are so angry are going to be pacified by a Republican president and Republican-controlled houses. And I had a student yesterday, I'll get off of this Vol State business in a minute. I had a student yesterday who's, she's kind of an exotic-looking character. She wears mostly black and chains, and her hair is real short and several different colors. And I mean, it kind of changes, but it's colors like green and purple, not like gray and blonde and brown. And she wears a lot of chains, and the first day of class when I call the roll, I always say, "Tell me what you want to be called." And so her name is a female name, and she said, I go by Angelo. I said, okay, wrote that down. So Angelo came into class yesterday, just a minute late. She has her backpack and her cell phone, and she sits down in the back where she's surrounded by people that I really thought were her friends. So, because there's a level of camaraderie back there on the back row. You sit back there so the teacher won't call on you. And so she got up very suddenly, and I hadn't even really finished checking the roll and with her cell phone, but she is clearly emotionally distressed. And she's got her head down, but I can tell she's heaving and crying. So she's gone for about 10 minutes. And she comes in, and I can see her through the window in the door that she is sobbing. I mean, really big time sobbing. So she goes back to her seat, grabs her backpack, and starts to leave. Well, she is so emotionally distressed that I followed her out of my classroom. And I closed the door to the classroom, went out in the hall, and I said, "Angelo, you are so upset. Did you get a bad message?" And that was when the dam burst. Tears are flowing. "You just don't understand. I am so scared about this election." I'm not dramatizing this, I promise. And she went on to tell me that this is how she put it. She put it as never quite said like this. She said, "I am a lesbian trans." And I think that means she wants to transition to become a man. But I mean, it doesn't matter to me. I see all sorts of folks. But, I'm not saying that seriously. But, and she said, "I'm so scared of all these people." And I thought all these people were her friends. She said, "You don't know how homophobic these people are." And I said, "Oh, yeah, I think actually I do." But anyway, I said, "Look, we got a lot of faculty members with these safe place stickers on our doors." I said, "Do you need me to get you somebody to talk to? What can I do for you? I'm going to protect you in my class." I knew it was, and I said, "Can I get somebody to come and talk to you? Or can I take you somewhere?" And she says, "No, my friend's coming to get me." And then, we also, at the state schools, we're very wary of anything that could be considered sexual harassment. So, by and large, we keep our hands off of everybody. The faculty does, and we never allow a student to come in our office and close the door because, we have had some situations at Vol State. So this girl then, sobbing, embraces me and puts her head on my shoulder in the hall like a 10 or 12-year-old child, and just sobs and sobs and sobs. And so clearly those people that sit back there with her, that went to high school with her, are not as tolerant as she perhaps thought they were. And so it is these people on the margins of the margin, that I am the most worried about. Not about Donald Trump, but about what other people who were avid Trump supporters are going to feel they now have the freedom to do and say to people. And that is my very biggest concern, that we've got a group of people now who feel the green light is on I can say to any Muslim who has a burqa on or just a scarf, go home, I can, and that's the thing about this whole thing that disturbs me the most. But again, I look at things from a very different lens, through a very different lens, because I see these people 5 days a week. So I'm happy to give you all a tour of rural Tennessee anytime y'all want to go. Come, Tommy will probably be a helper and help me along. Now, when we left, so that's enough about the election. All right, let's move on. When we left, Rutherford B. Hayes had become president in one of the most heavily disputed elections up to this point. And it was disputed because we had these states that the Democrats and the Republicans both said the electoral votes are ours. So a deal was made a few days before a president was to be sworn in, which in those days was March the 4th. A deal was made with a presidential commission that had been appointed by Congress that Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, would become president, but it was a compromise. The Compromise of 1877 is what this is called. In this Compromise of 1877, the Republicans would get the White House, but the Democrats wanted the soldiers removed out of the South. Why were there soldiers still in the South in 1877? Protecting the former slaves from their former owners. And the Klan was alive and well. There'd been some huge riots. One, if you want to Google something and read about it, read about the Colfax massacre or riot that took place in Louisiana in 1873. The cost of protecting these folks was much higher than any anti-slavery abolitionists living in the North could ever have imagined, because just like people living in a certain part of town cannot imagine how angry rural Americans are, also Northerners could not understand how angry people who had lost all their slaves were and who they blamed for it. So the cost was just much, much higher than they had bargained for. And, you know, the war's been over 12 years. Let's get on with things. This is the period of time that Mark Twain named the Gilded Age, because things looked a whole lot better than they were. So the soldiers were removed from the South. The ex-Confederates came back into power in all of the 11 states of the former Confederacy. And when the ex-Confederates returned to political power, they very systematically rewrote their state constitutions, made it much harder for African Americans to get registered to vote, and we go into this long, dark period of Jim Crow segregation. And Northerners abandoned the African Americans that the Civil War had been fought to free. So the Democrats got the troops out of the South, and all of those ex-Confederates are going to mostly vote Democratic. And the third thing they wanted was one seat on the president's cabinet. And so the seat that the Democrats wanted the most on the president's cabinet, not Secretary of Treasury, not Secretary of State, not Attorney General, they wanted the position of Postmaster General. Now, that may seem kind of odd to some of you, but listen, I grew up in Ector, Texas, population 454. The most powerful man in town was Shobe Ray, who was our postmaster. We had a combo, post office, grocery store, feed store, ice selling business in a space that was smaller than 1/3 of this room. He did it all. But let me tell you, when Sam Rayburn came to town, he came out to Shobe Ray's post office combo establishment, sat on a stool, and ate a big old greasy hamburger that Shobe made for him, and he took care of his constituents quite well. So, postmasters in rural America were jobs programs. And these were federal jobs, and the President of the United States can't be appointing postmasters in Buchanan, Tennessee, or Ector, Texas, or wherever. So that is usually left up to the congressman from that district to be the patronage chief. And so consequently, the Democrats really wanted the position of patronage chief, meaning the Postmaster General's position. But you have to look here at this period of time after Reconstruction ended. I think you have to look at this as a time when there wasn't a whole lot of interest in politics, and there certainly was not any real dynamic leadership much in the presidents that followed Abraham Lincoln, the members of Congress that were in Congress during the Gilded Age. Most of the power in the country mostly resided with the captains of industry. This is the time when the modern American capitalistic system really takes off. We've got these folks out there. We're sitting in the university named for one of these people, Cornelius Vanderbilt, but there were lots of others. Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller. These captains of industry, they like to be called. People derisively referred to them as robber barons. Some people call them the organizers, and otherwise, and they did organize the economy and the stock market and capitalizing, raising enough money to capitalize bigger and bigger projects. So you'll have to look at some of these guys. There's some really good biographies. I read one 4 or 5 years ago about Vanderbilt. There's a really good one about Cornelius, about Andrew Carnegie, and there's another one about John D. Rockefeller. So if you're interested, these are fascinating books to read. So they really are the people who really don't want a lot of government because they feel that they can be unrestrained to make money, which is the American dream. And so as a result of all of this, we start having these sort of myths appearing. Industrialization really sort of challenges this myth of rural, idyllic American life, these pastoral scenes of these farm communities. And so you see these captains of industry sort of creating their own set of myths, which are the myths of the self-made man. And that whole notion of self-made man goes all the way back to Ben Franklin and the Puritans. You know, work hard, save your money, and stay out of trouble was Franklin's, all of those sayings of Poor Richard. And so they sort of took all of these ideas that were mostly myth and put them together. And so Horatio Alger did a very fine job of writing all these novels for young boys. And the stories are always the kind of rags to riches success. They generally start in a small town. These boys sell newspapers. They do all sorts of things to make money, and they work hard, and suddenly they become the American dream. They become wealthy. And so one of the symbols of this age is Abraham Lincoln, because he really personified this as much as anything else. And so politicians, anybody that's going to run for anything, is going to really extol these rural virtues, these self-made man virtues, whether they're true about them or not. And you know, you look at all the people who served as president after Lincoln, they all really gloried in their small town roots. And look at how many of these people came from the Midwest as well when you're looking at these things. All of these folks that became president after Lincoln, after Johnson, I guess I should say, except for Grant and James Garfield, they were all lawyers, but they didn't really enjoy practicing law. And their success never really came from practicing law so much as it came from being able to communicate with people and being able to get votes. And so you've got these powerful men, but they don't really want to be president of the United States, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, but they certainly do want to exert political influence. And if you look at some of the images, for example, of the Tuskegee Institute, an educational institution in Alabama founded for the purpose of educating former slaves, founded by Booker T. Washington, who was very much of a philosophy of work hard and don't pay so much attention to politics. Cast down your bucket where you are. He said, you look at some of the photos and you'll see somebody like Andrew Carnegie sitting on the right in the middle on the front row, because Andrew Carnegie gave a lot of money to Tuskegee. Did he give a lot of money to Fisk? No, because Fisk believed that the only way African Americans were really going to get ahead was with an education equal to education offered by anybody, a classical education, the sciences, whereas Tuskegee was more of a technical school, not exclusively, but more of a technical school. So you can see, watch where these people made their charitable contributions, and you can see a lot about their outlooks on life. So, this rural society is going to produce William McKinley and William Jennings Bryan, who will collide. They're really actually on pretty close course. They will collide in 1896 in the presidential race. But as I think you got the idea from last week, you know, a lot of these elections, the fights in the conventions were enormous, and there was no front runner going into the convention. That's a dramatic change today. So I want to show you a few slides to get us up to the fight in 1896. All right. 1876. The Compromise of 1877, Hayes became president. The major issues, now, you know, I can put students to sleep faster if I start talking about the tariff than any other subject. And when my son, who's 38 years old, wants to complain about his high school education, he refers back to how much time that teacher spent on the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And, you know, if any talk about tariff is too much. And that's because we just don't get it. Because the kids don't get it. Because the Customs House brought in the revenue for the federal government, the overwhelming amount of the revenue for the federal government. We did not have an income tax until the 20th century. And so the tariff was a big subject of debate. Some felt like the tariff should be so high that it should protect American manufacturers. And that's not a new idea. Alexander Hamilton had that idea first, a high protective tariff. But there were others, particularly people who represent farmers. Farmers are these achieving people. They are having a hard time after the Civil War. And this industrialization of the country with all this technical influence from machinery is causing the farmers to sink. Farming is hard under any circumstances. So the farmers are going to start saying, we need a low tariff because we think the tariff impedes the sale of our products. So farmers want a low tariff, and businessmen, manufacturers want a high protective tariff. We start arguing over the money supply. should our currency be backed by gold, or should it be just greenbacks, just print out the currency and just a totally inflated economy? Or should we come up with something kind of in the middle, a bimetal standard where our currency is backed by gold and or silver? So this is a subject of great debate. And the railroads are the big Goliath, not just in Tennessee, but really they were the political power. And they required a lot of money, they built a lot of things, and the railroads, some people had begun to say, you know, you need to regulate these railroads. The government needs to control them. Well, now that's kind of anti-American. Government telling businesses what to do. So you can imagine that for the people who say the railroads are fixing prices, they're negotiating things and making deals with each other, it's not competitive, you can hear the railroads saying this is the free enterprise system. So there is tension here, again, rural-urban conflict at this point in time. So, another problem is all these people on the federal payroll. The president sweeps in and all these people get appointed to jobs, so they wanted a federal civil service. They wanted not patronage jobs, but they wanted jobs that were secure so that you won't lose your job when there is a change of political party in the White House. And the people who are doing less well in the United States in the Gilded Age, farmers and laborers, they want government to do more, but the captains of industry want government to do as little as possible and let the free market system work the way it will. So, as I mentioned, James Garfield was elected president, succeeding Rutherford B. Hayes. He was elected in 1880. People saw this election as the end of the country. They saw, and Garfield is kind of he's a brilliant man. Read a biography of him. That book I mentioned last week, Destiny of the Republic, is excellent. But we never knew what kind of a president he would be. But when he won the White House that year over the Democratic Party, this flyer went around the country. The Democratic Party had died on the day of the election. And so if you go on to read this came from the Library of Congress website. If you go on to read this, it blames the Democratic Party's leadership for causing all the problems that a lot of people didn't like. So, Garfield became president. He is elected in spite of the fact that with the ex-Confederates now back in power, the Solid South is indeed solid. Now, many of you have heard me say on many times that Tennessee is always questionable, because Tennessee mostly voted with the Solid South, but because of East Tennessee and that strong pro-union sentiment in East Tennessee before the Civil War, during the Civil War, after the Civil War, that became the Republican Party of Tennessee, the Democrats would fight so much that about every 10, 15, 20 years, a Republican in Tennessee would get elected governor. That didn't happen in the Deep South, but it happened in Tennessee with some frequency. So 1884, Garfield had been shot. His vice president, Chester A. Arthur, who had been part of the Tammany Hall machine, and the Tammany Hall machine was opposed to a lot of reform ideas. So he is the one that actually was sort of, with his arm being twisted behind his neck, Chester A. Arthur had to get the Federal Civil Service Commission created and established. So Arthur's out. The Democrats nominate Grover Cleveland. The Republicans nominate that half-breed James G. Blaine, who had criticized Ulysses S. Grant's presidency. So Cleveland wins the presidency. Now, Grover Cleveland This guy is an interesting case because there were lots and lots of rumors running around the country about Grover Cleveland without Twitter, without Facebook. There were rumors. And I can remember when I was a child, my grandmother would sing this song. And she was born in 1881, but Grover Cleveland serves 2 non-consecutive terms as president. But my grandmother would sing, Cleveland was elected, not what we expected. And it went on to, the song went on to talk about the fact that Cleveland had this child out there that was with a woman that he was not married to. And so that was apparently common knowledge. But Cleveland was not necessarily a strong candidate. The Democrats were divided, so were the Republicans, and it's this whole notion of the tariff and the gold standard. And Cleveland was a Democrat, but Cleveland was a hard money man. He wanted the currency backed by gold, which is not what the farmers want or support at all. So in 1888, when he runs for president, Benjamin Harrison runs against him, and guess what? Benjamin Harrison squeaked out a little bit of a victory there. And this minor party there in 1888 is that pesky Greenback Party that wants inflated currency with money being produced without being backed by gold. So Benjamin Harrison's claim to fame is that he inherited a surplus in the national treasury. Now, this is 1889 when he becomes president. The nations of Europe, particularly Great Britain and Germany, trying to catch up with Great Britain, are building up big navies. So, Benjamin Harrison, his legacy is that following a lot of pressure he's getting from naval experts, he takes the surplus and invests it in a great big modern United States Navy, which we'll be able to have a physical presence of ships on either side of the country, but we really are looking over there towards Asia. This didn't start in the 1970s and 80s. It started in the 1890s. So the Greenbacks didn't do much damage. Harrison is elected. But the voting is so tight that 2 years later, we're going to see Cleveland defeating Harrison. So that whole thing defies everything I really believe about political parties. My strong feeling is a candidate who has lost the election for president once should not run twice. And, my case in point is Adlai Stevenson and some others along the way. So anyway, Cleveland defies that statement I've made on many occasions. All right. Let's talk about the farmers, because the farmers are hurting. How bad do you have to hurt before you start organizing politically? Well, across the South and the Midwest, this was by no means confined to the South, but across the South and the Midwest, farmers are meeting together, and they have a lot of different names. It's the Grange. In Tennessee, we had an agricultural wheel. We have the Farmers Alliance. We have these various groups of farmers, and they're talking about their problems. And the chief problem is that all of their commodities, the price per pound or bushel, continues to go down. Now, let me show you a chart of Tennessee, and some of you on the front row can probably read these numbers. Some of you may not be able to in the back, but I will just kind of give you the short of this. It is a chart of Tennessee agricultural products, the price per pound or bushel from 1870 to 1900. Now, what you see if you look at this is they started going down and never really quite came back up. Tobacco seemed to, over this 30-year period, lose the least value, but they all lost some value here. And why are they losing value? Because they are producing more. Now, Rick, as our economist here, what happens when the supply increases?
I think price goes down.
The price goes down. So these farmers see their big mortal enemy as the railroad. You need a face on your enemy if you're going to have one, and the farmers put it on the railroads in general. So these farmers are trying to start organizing politically, and eventually they're going to be so angry and so mad that they will start meeting across state lines, and they finally get around to meeting in Omaha, Nebraska. Now, if you, as a group of farmers, even though this is kind of Thomas Jefferson's dream, a nation of yeoman farmers, you got to get somebody else to join you who also is hurting and is not happy with the situation. Can the farmers get organized labor to join them in a united front against big business? This is what the conflict is. And so there is a meeting in Omaha, Nebraska in 1890. Now keep in mind, this is not a presidential year. 1890 is an off-year congressional election. But they organized the People's Party of the United States, better known as the Populist Party. Now, the funny thing about this meeting is that they had a woman preside over the meetings. Frances Willard, the Women's Christian Temperance Union leader, presided over this big Omaha convention of the People's Party. The Knights of Labor leaders were in attendance. The farm leaders from various states were in attendance as well. And in 1890, presidential election, 2 years away, in 1890, they go ahead and nominate James B. Weaver, one of the founders of this organization, for president for 1892. But that is sort of inconsequential because people don't remember James Weaver too much, even though he did run for president. What they do remember is out of that Omaha meeting, they set an agenda. This is what we want. This is our platform. So let's see what they wanted. That's a nod to the Knights of Labor there. Legalization of labor unions. Captains of industry, are y'all going to support that? I don't think so. All right. Free and unlimited coinage of gold and silver. And on that score, this whole notion of money being backed by silver, they had the support of the far west where there were silver mines, and the silver mine owners saw this as beneficial to them. So they were going to be willing to support that. They want more paper money, inflated currency. They want, this is a novel idea, now we want to get rid of it, a graduated income tax. You know, taxes should be based on how much money people make. They wanted the post offices to run savings banks. Now, see, that seems kind of foreign to us, but they saw banks as part of the problem. So if this government agency, the post office, can let us put our savings there, it'll be safe, right? The government will back our savings. So they knew, this is no surprise. Woo, this sounds like socialism. Public ownership of railroads, telegraphs, telephone systems. They saw that government ownership was in their best interest. That's not all. There's more. They didn't like, now I don't mean alien by meaning people in London owning land in the United States. What they didn't like were the amount of land that the railroads owned that was not cultivated for farming, that just sat there, owned by the railroads. They'd been giving these big, enormous right-of-ways, and they didn't like this notion of people who wanted to farm not being able to have a farm, and then this other land just being held for whatever reason to hope the value would go up. Pensions for ex-union veterans, okay, that's not a subject to argue about. Shorter work hours, an 8-hour day. They wanted these Pinkertons removed. Now, you all, Pinkerton's not a familiar term for many of you, but it was these private police that were called in when there was a strike, for instance, at the Carnegie, some of the Carnegie companies in Pennsylvania. The Pinkertons were brought in. There was a strike at the Homestead plant, and the Pinkertons were brought in to put down various strikes. So this People's Party want to end the use of the Pinkertons. Initiative and Referendum, California, you should have seen their voter's guide. The voter's guide was at least an inch thick. And my son, who I spoke to at length yesterday about the election, who lives in California, had sat down and read the whole thing before he voted. And I was very impressed, but I mean, it is a huge deal. So they wanted the referendums, that California has had that for a long time. Limit the presidency to 1 term. Now, this had been brought up in about 1815, I suppose, but they were in 1815. The Federalists wanted a 6-year term, not a 4-year term, without succession. So they also wanted the people to be able to elect the senators. They wanted women to have the right to vote. They had a whole big agenda. So how much of this did the People's Party get accomplished? Did Weaver get many votes in 1892? Well, yes, Weaver got some electoral votes, more than these other third parties that have been popping up here and there. But the populists didn't get their agenda out there. Even with Weaver's attention at getting electoral votes, they didn't get 1 iota of it passed. However, that long list became our national agenda, and it held up, I would say all the way up to through Franklin Roosevelt and even beyond Franklin Roosevelt, that agenda. And it's amazing how much of that got accomplished. Hank?
Can you go back a couple of slides to the one that, what do you mean by pensions for ex-union veterans?
Well, there was a debate as to who should be paying the pensions. And as I understand it, many of these pensions were paid by the states, not the national government. And, you know, one thing that's somebody can probably, who knows more about military history than I certainly do, Ulysses S. Grant, when he became president, he forfeited whatever kind of union pension he was going to have for being the general. And even though he was very popular, when he went out of the White House, he had made some bad investments and he was broke. And so his friend Mark Twain, he's getting Grant's developing cancer from all those cigars he smoked, his throat cancer, and he knows his days are numbered. So Grant, Mark Twain persuades him to write your memoir. And the memoir is very successful, and it produced enough money to take care of his widow when Grant did in fact die. So in Tennessee, the Confederate pensions were all provided by the Tennessee General Assembly. So the capitalists don't get much done, but they're still hanging around. So 1892, Grover Cleveland comes back into the White House, and bam, there is a major depression, the Panic of 1893, the worst one we have ever had up to this point, because we've got more people living in the cities, more people are laid off from their jobs, more people can't feed themselves. We can blame all sorts of people for it. We can blame not being on the gold standard. We can blame various monetary policy, but the bubble burst. And so, needless to say, Grover Cleveland's political career is over. And so now when the next election comes along, the country is still suffering in 1896, and both parties are wide open as to who they're going to nominate. So enter the picture this list of characters running for the Republican nomination. William McKinley is by no means the front runner, at least before the convention, but William McKinley had become good friends with another Ohioan. He was from Ohio, Mark Hanna. And Mark Hanna saw political potential in William McKinley, and so before the convention ever took place, William McKinley had suddenly become a national politician. He had been in Congress, but through gerrymandering, he had lost his position in Congress. He went back to Canton, Ohio, where when he gets the he went back and practiced law, and when he got the nomination, he campaigned in a very different way from his opponent, William Jennings Bryan, because he sat on his front porch and let operatives do all the hard work for him. So we'll get to that in just a minute. So William McKinley has a very interesting life story, which I'm going to save till next week, but it's really quite interesting. I'll tell you a little more, but he's the Republican candidate, and they're confident he can get elected. So the Democrats have a whole slew of people who want to be president, and there's no political magician behind any of these guys making the deals, passing votes back and forth. And so as you see here, this vote begins to change by the fourth and fifth ballot, and so the nominee becomes William Jennings Bryan, one of the more colorful figures in American history. And William Jennings Bryan, his whole claim to fame is that he is a very fine public speaker and orator. In the days when giving public speeches was entertainment, people went to hear public lectures, they enjoyed that sort of thing. So through a lot of back behind the scenes dealing, William Jennings Bryan gets the nomination. Now, he was I won't say he was he was completely at odds with President Grover Cleveland about the gold standard, because Cleveland wanted the country on the gold standard, particularly after the Panic of 1893, and Bryan said, no, we've got to have a bimetal standard and inflated currency. So after he gets the nomination, he gives the speech of his life, which becomes known as the Cross of Gold speech. Now, if you go onto your computer this afternoon, go onto YouTube and Google Cross of Gold speech, and you will get Bryan giving the speech, but it was not recorded in 1896. It was recorded in 1921, but you hear his voice giving the speech, but it's not a live performance of it at the time it was given. But this brought the house down. This man was a moralist. He was really a revivalist. He was there to emotionally ignite people on the subjects that were near and dear to him and to stir up emotion, and he was quite successful at doing that. So he's up there on the dais accepting the Democratic nomination, and he talks about the gold standard. You shall not bear down on mankind a crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold. Lots of religious imagery. That got our friend Frank Clement into trouble at the 1956 Democratic Convention. So Frank Clement was not the first to give a speech at a convention with lots of religious imagery. So Bryan starts his campaign. The Democrats don't have a lot of money, but interestingly enough, the populists who want to nominate somebody, but they don't really have anybody, they don't want to nominate Weaver again, the populists decide to endorse the Democratic candidate, Bryan. So you know what this is going to do. If two parties nominate the same guy, one of those parties is going to be gone come the next election. And so it looked like the populists were going to take over the Democratic Party, but really what happened was the Democrats ended up being the survivor, and the People's Party, the Populist Party, faded away. And I think this cartoon, which is the note on which I'll end, really says it all. Here you have William Jennings Bryan, the head of this populist snake, eating this poor little donkey alive. That is not what happened. This was our first modern campaign because Mark Hanna had lots of money and they printed literature and leaflets, lots of flyers about McKinley. Bryan only had himself. He rode the train across the country giving the same speech over and over, some variation of the Cross of Gold speech. It was successful once, it can be successful again, but after he said nothing new in all of these whistle stops, people start getting tired of him. And, you know, the McKinley people don't have to do much, but the more Bryan campaigns, the more he looks like kind of a fanatic. And so this election turns out not to be very close at all. I'll show you the map, and then next week I will start with the dirty, interesting things about the campaign. So here's the map. Bryan carried the solid South, including Tennessee. He declared the Midwest and the places where silver was being mined, but the electoral vote as well as the popular vote went to William McKinley. What did the people of the United States say in this election with their vote? They said, we want the Republican Party of William McKinley to lead us into the 20th century. We don't want William Jennings Bryan and the Democratic Party and or the Populist Party. We want this party of McKinley leading us into the 20th century, and that's precisely what happened. Thank you very much. Now, I will see you all